Hello and welcome to this month's Dr. Pool's SharePoint Surgery session, GDPR Compliance, Practical Strategies for Information Governance. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started. You're welcome to submit questions at any time using the chat window on your screen. We'll address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's webinar. If we don't manage to answer all of your questions, someone will follow up with you shortly via email. We'll also make a recording of the webcast available to you within a couple of days. It's my pleasure to introduce you to today's speakers, David Lavenda, VP Product Strategy at Harmony, and Richard Poole, Chief Technology Officer of EMEA at Harmony. David is a frequent contributor at Fast Company and is a founding member of the Reader Advisory Board at CMS Wire, where he writes a monthly column. David holds a master's degree in science, technology, and society and is now pursuing a doctorate in information management, focusing his academic research on exploring the information overload experienced by mobile workers. David is also an international scholar for the Society for the History of Technology. Richard heads up the pre-sales team for Harmony across EMEA and Asia Pacific regions, working both directly with key accounts as well as Harmony's partner channel. Bringing with him 18 years of experience in data management systems, Richard has helped many companies to realize the significant benefits in productivity that collaborative platforms enable. Before joining Harmony in 2011, Richard worked for Dassault Systems PLM for over 10 years. Richard also has a Bachelor of Engineering degree in Automotive Engineering from Loughborough University. David, please get us started.
Yes, thanks, Susan. So welcome everyone to today's webinar on GDPR compliance and to get us started, maybe we'll just start by talking a moment about what GDPR is, although most of you probably know, just to get a level set. GDPR is the General Data Protection Regulation, which was adopted by the EU in 2016, and its intention is to protect personal data for citizens of the European Union. These are really strict requirements, the most strict requirements posed to date, and they govern how companies must manage and protect personal data of individuals in the EU, regardless of where that data is created, processed, stored, or sent. And that's quite a broad requirements. What do they mean by personal data? Well, that's actually more sweeping than you might think. So it includes things like name, maybe your ID number, email address, phone numbers, user IDs, but it also includes things like social media content, like posts, medical information, like genetic, physiological, or mental data, and also things like ethnic, social, cultural, and religious information. It also includes things like person's physical location, financial details like a bank account, and even browser history or in cookies stored on people's devices. So this is an extremely broad list of information that must be protected. Next slide.
Before you get to the next slide, David, I'd like to ask our audience, are you already GDPR compliant? And please answer, you are compliant, you're not yet compliant, or you really just don't know. Give it just a minute for everybody to answer. Great, thank you. Go on.
Okay. Well, this is something GDPR is something you need to be concerned about because it's coming really quickly. Compliance requirements are for the 25th of May, which is only 114 days to go before you need to be compliant. So there's a lot of work to do that needs to be done before that date to be compliant. So you really need to sit up and take notice of what you need to do and also what you may not need to do by that date. If you're not all that compliant, you're probably in good company. A survey from last year found that about 45% of organizations did not know that GDPR was to go into effect in May 2018. And although that number, I'm sure, is a lot less today, about 40% of people last year admitted that they wouldn't be ready on time. So considering the amount of work that needs to go into being compliant, it's not surprising that that a lot of folks are not ready yet for this. Next slide.
For that, let's just ask then, will you be GDPR compliant by the 25th of May? And please just answer one of the options on your screen. Yes, you absolutely will be, or no, you will have started the process by the 25th. No, but you do plan to be compliant by the end of 2018. You don't think you need to be GDPR compliant, or you don't know if or when you need to be GDPR compliant. So that's great. Thank you. All right, David. There you go.
Okay. Well, the ramifications of not being compliant are actually huge. The maximum penalties for organizations that are not compliant can be 20 million euros or 4% of your organization's turnover. So this is something that really needs to be taken into account. Now, what does it mean for compliance? So there are 6 real things that need to be taken care of in order for you to be compliant. So just I'll run through this list fairly quickly. One is you need to be able to demonstrate transparency for process and for using personal data. Secondly, you need to limit the collection of personal data just for intended purposes only. So you can't use personal data for other things. Limit the processing of personal data to legitimate and specified purposes. So if you collect data for something and you can only process it for that use. A big one is allowing people to correct or request the deletion of their personal data. So you can't hold on to people's data if they don't want you to. 5 is limiting the storage of personal data to the time required for intended purposes. So you have to have a disposition policy and be able to carry that out and show that it's been carried out. And lastly, one that's quite broad is to ensure personal data is protected both in rest and on the wire. So it's quite broad. There are a lot of things you need to do, but you should know that there's no formal requirement for GDPR certification. So in this way, GDPR shares a lot with other information governance and compliance directives that dictate that you need to have processes in place. You need to be able to demonstrate that you're making best efforts to do things. And therefore, the takeaway is that a lot of the best practices for information compliance directives can be applied successfully to GDPR compliance. So a lot of things that you've already been doing or that have been done for other types of compliance projects can be applied quite successfully to GDPR, and that's really good news. Next slide. So before we go into some of the things that actually can be done, one last thing about who's affected, because it's not really clear from the outset that this just affects EU organizations, because that's really not the case. GDPR actually introduces several concepts of people who hold and process information. So one of them is called a controller, and that's an entity like a person or an organization who owns the data. And there's also something called a processor, which is an entity who processes personal data. And then there's a recipient. So these are entities to whom personal data is disclosed, such as government agencies or even third parties. So in practice, in many cases, the controller and the processor may be one and the same. That's you, the organization who collects, processes, and stores personal data about customers, prospects, partners, and suppliers. And it is your responsibility to implement appropriate technological and organizational measures to ensure that personal data usage is consistent with GDPR. So maybe a really critical point to make before we move on to specific actions that you can take is to note that GDPR, while being a European regulation, it is indeed global in scope. So it covers the handling of personal data from EU citizens, regardless of where the information is collected, processed, or stored. So therefore, the scope of organizations who need to be concerned about GDPR is much broader than just European organizations, and the repercussions for non-compliance can be severe regardless of where your organization is located. Next slide. So we've identified 7 areas that you need to address GDPR compliance. And 4 of these are areas specifically where Harmony can help you be compliant. But before we go through the 4 areas where Harmony can help you be compliant and actually see in practice how this works through a live demo, just quickly going through the 7 areas. So one is obtaining consent for personal data location. Second is storing personal information centrally. This is a way one of the ways to help address compliance. Third is to have audits in place. 4 is to make personal information easy to find. 5 is to design for privacy. 6 to have practical record management processes in place, and 7 is to delete the data when required. So let's look briefly at a few of these. Obtaining consent. So our tips here are to collect only what is necessary. Secondly is to explain why you're collecting the data. Allow people to opt out of anything but the essentials if they so wish. And as is often the case with many compliance initiatives, is to train your staff to understand the implications for collecting data, particularly people in call centers and service folks. Auditing personal data. So you know, you can't protect data that you don't know you have. So being able to go through and see what information you have is critical, and to make sure you don't collect more than you need. And lastly, deleting data when required. So getting rid of all the stuff you don't need anymore. Old data is an albatross around your neck in the world of information governance and compliance. So, and also you can't manage what you don't know you have. So, so capturing, classifying emails and documents, and making sure you know what you have so you can get rid of them is really important. So understanding what you have and having good disposition processes in place is really critical. So now let's look at the things that were the 4 areas where Harmony can specifically help you with GDPR compliance. The first one is storing personal information centrally. So you know, one of the critical things, much of the information that you have about clients and prospects may be contained in emails, people working and communicating with customers or prospects, people who may send in information and questions and responses to customers. So having all that information locked in people's inbox is really a danger for compliance. So one of the things you want to do is to make sure that information is stored centrally. Unify all the information in a central repository. For most people on this call, I'm assuming that a lot of that is going to be done in SharePoint. Secondly, if eliminating shadow IT, specifically for information that contains customer or prospect personal data, is really important, because those are almost impossible to get your arms around and to to know what information is in those systems. So standardizing on SharePoint is a good idea. And then secondly, and lastly, is also to make it really easy for users to move content from the tools that they use. Like if you do still have shared drives, or you're certainly using email, to make that information really easy to get into SharePoint through what we call selective migration. So having ways and making it super easy for people to move the information to the place that you dictate ahead of time is important to get compliance, because with most things in compliance, making the right thing the easy thing is the key to getting people to do what you need to in order for them to help you be compliant with the requirements. Next slide. So making personal information easy to find is critical because like most compliance requirements with GDPR, in order to be able to demonstrate that you're compliant, if required to do so, you need to be able to find the information. So it's not just enough to store it, but you also be able to have to produce it. For example, when people want their information deleted, you have to be able to know what you have and to be able to find that. So you need to deploy technology which allows you to search across environments. So SharePoint and now Office 365 has a unified infrastructure and a Microsoft Graph API to help you find information. Those are really good tools to be able to find what you've got. Certainly, you can't find what you don't classify properly. So using metadata is absolutely critical to be able to find information later on. And we all know that assigning metadata to things like emails and documents is not easy because it requires people to take extra steps. So we definitely want to make that as easy as possible for people to do that. And we'll show you some examples of that in the demo. Also, classifying emails. You know, this may be not as intuitive as classifying documents, but emails are also will be difficult to find. And if you're able to assign metadata to them easily, it'll be much easier to find them later on. And we'll show you how to do that. Particularly today, it's important because a lot of information with customers flows through emails. And really, there's not much difference today between a document and an email message in terms of important information about customers. Next slide. So just to make that point again, a lot of customer information passes through emails. So making it easy to capture and classify in a central repository is really important. So designing for privacy is important, so that you set up ahead of time. People know exactly what they're allowed to store, what they need to store, because not all things like emails are not all emails are important to store. In fact, we find that in information governance and compliance projects, usually only about 5% of emails are things that we would call records that would need to be stored. Although about 85% of records are emails. So 5% of all emails are records, but 85% of the records tend to be emails. So designing that for privacy and allowing people to be able to know what they're supposed to do is also very important. Next slide. So lastly, the last area where Harmony can help is crafting a practical record management processes. So setting up record management processes, knowing what you need to store, telling people how to do that, very important. But the last mile is really the critical piece. So no matter how well you design your processes and your procedures, if people can't easily comply to them and do what they're supposed to do, then everything falls apart. So you can have the best rules and you can show regulators that you've done a lot in terms of defining things, but if people don't actually capture the information, whether it's documents or emails, classify them accurately, and then they just won't be able to be found afterwards. So ultimately, staff has to be responsible, and in order to make them responsible, you have to make things easy for them to be able to do. So with that, I'd like to turn over the controls to my colleague Richard Poole. We've seen and heard about some of the things that you need to do to be compliant, and pictures, as I always say, a picture tells 1,000 words. So let's see in practice how Harmony can actually help you be GDPR compliant.
Thank you very much, David, and hello, everyone. So let's take a look at some of those examples of how Harmony can really facilitate the whole kind of GDPR process. And as David said, I think one of the first hurdles is actually capturing the content that you need into a single repository. Now, obviously, being able to access that location, that SharePoint site, for example, from an environment that is familiar to people is a big step. It's a big first step in the right direction. So, for example, here, like where I've received some emails that I need to store into SharePoint, being able to easily navigate around my SharePoint sites, as well as my OneDrive and my Teams and groups and things as well, but easily being able to actually find the location that I need to save correspondence into really helps that kind of getting content in the first place. So Harmony gives you a number of different ways to actually achieve this. Now, obviously, you can navigate around SharePoint, you can search for a location, all those kind of things. But also, what Harmony can do is actually suggest locations that you may want to save your content to based on intelligent information. So, for example, here I could navigate to a particular library that I want to save this email to and simply drag and drop it. That's a nice, easy way to select the items that I want to put into SharePoint. It doesn't need to be just individual items, but it could be multiple emails that all relate to the same kind of information. And as I'm capturing those emails, it is also capturing the relevant metadata as well. So again, this kind of comes down to not only capturing the content, but also being able to classify it. So later on, I can actually find it easily as well. So let's just go ahead and save that email into this location. But let's take a slightly different example where I don't know where I need to save this, this particular email. So you can see that when I click on some of the ribbon controls that Harmony offers, it actually shows me the recent locations I've been using, like the location we just saved that to, or it can actually suggest locations based on what we call topics that have been identified by the email that you've selected. So being able to get that in an intuitive way and a concise way is really powerful. So for example here, Harmony has actually identified some key topics from this email. So in this instance, the name of the account or the name of the project or those kind of things, and it's identified those as topics. And then what we can do is we can use those topics to suggest locations as well. So we've got some recommended locations here. So for example, because it's identified certain keywords, it's actually suggesting a particular location in a particular SharePoint site for me to save that email to. So there's a number of different ways to capture my content. And as David said, it's not just the emails that you have, because those emails may come from, they may currently be tied up in individuals' mailboxes. They may also be tied up in people's PST files or public folders, for example, in Exchange. But having a single repository to put all of that information into makes it a lot easier to manage. So, for example, here, I've got a library where I've got all the correspondence that relates to a particular project or a particular initiative in one place. And I can see that I've got a nice focused view of that information in SharePoint, not only from my Outlook, but also in a browser. If I go into the SharePoint library, I can see that information as well. So Harmony's adding extra value to the content that you are capturing. And so, for example, when I'm capturing that content, we can also take the topics that have been identified and map those as metadata as well. So if we take a look at the example we had a moment ago, where I just saved this document to a particular location. Again, I can navigate easily to that folder, for example, and then I can see in that instance that I actually have mapped across some of the topics that Harmony identified. So the fact, for example, that this relates to a particular client, a particular partner, or anything like that. So Harmony, again, is really helping me to classify as well as capture the content. Now, the big thing there is that I'm then able to actually find the content further down the line. So as an example here, if I say that I now want to find all the documents that have been either tagged as GDPR, for example. So if I go ahead and search for that, you'll see that Harmony is supporting the SharePoint search capabilities. So it's actually returning everywhere where that term or that keyword is actually being referenced. Now that might be in the body of an email, or it might be in the metadata of certain content as well. Likewise, if I want to search for, let's say, emails that are referencing a particular person's name. So in this instance, if I search for Matt Smith, who is referenced in this email. So let me just go ahead and type that. Then you'll see that Matt Smith has been mentioned not only in some emails, but also in some documents as well. So from here, I can actually see wherever that information has been found. So it's very, very easy then to retrieve that information. And for example, if in the future I need to maybe delete that information, if I've got permission to do that, then I can easily do that directly from here. But also I can change the scope of that search. So at the moment, I'm just searching maybe all of my sites, or I could narrow that down to a particular site or a particular library as well. So Harmony across the board, you know, in each of those areas that we've just looked at, really helps to facilitate the capture of content, facilitate where I want to save my content, put it into a central repository nice and easily, but also to capture the relevant information around that content as well. So I've got a single interface to everything that I'm working in, as well as being able to find and retrieve all of that information in one go as well. So there's also, if we take a look at the kind of control of what I can see. Now, obviously, I'm navigating around SharePoint, and Harmony utilizes all the SharePoint capabilities. So everything I see here is what I've got permission to access. So if there's content that I don't have permission to access, I will never see it in Harmony. So for example, you know, like if I go into this correspondence library, it may be that there's a whole load of other content in that particular library, but because I don't have permission to access it, I can't see it. So again, you know, like you can control who can see what information is stored, how it's managed, and how it is utilized. So hopefully that's given you a short introduction on how Harmony can really facilitate all of the requirements of the GDPR initiative, so that you can be compliant and capture all your content into one single repository, make use of it, and be able to retrieve it very easily. So let's just go back to the presentation. And I believe we have one last poll question.
Great, thank you, Richard. So while I'm looking at the questions that have been coming in during both your and David's bit, we're going to ask you if you're already using Harmony, and if you'd be interested in trying the Harmony Enterprise, which has some of these features that Richard was showing. So I'll keep that up for a moment while I look at the questions that have come in. Let's see. Do any Harmony customers use Harmony to be compliant with things other than GDPR, Richard?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, one of our core use cases is supporting compliance initiatives, whether that's, you know, for, you know, kind of government requirements or kind of traceability, maybe in, you know, for example, in the automotive industry. And so we've got many customers that use Harmony to facilitate those initiatives. As just some kind of examples of those are Canada Post, the postal service in Canada, lots of local and provincial governments like Waterford Council in Ireland, national government agencies like the Australian Treasury, for example, but also, as I say, other types of industries. So let's say financial organizations such as Aon and Citigroup and the like, but also kind of more commercial organizations like Hilton Hotels, and as I mentioned, you know, like automotive customers as well, where they need to be able to trace who, you know, track who said what, when, and why for certain decisions that have been made and those kind of things. So an example of that is Porsche in Germany, but we've got many examples that you can find out much more in-depth information about on our website. Take a look at harman.ie and take a look at the case study area, where there's many examples of customers and their use cases where Harmony has supported their kind of compliance and governance initiatives and requirements.
Thank you for that very comprehensive answer. All right, let's see. I think that answered a couple of the questions here. How about this? Can you capture emails and attachments from Outlook if I'm using Outlook in my browser?
Yes, actually we do. We have an OWA app that is available from the Office store, and if I just open up a browser, I can give you a quick look of it. So if we just go to Outlook in a browser, as an example, just log in as myself. And if I select an email, you can see that I've also got an app, a Harmony app, available within the browser interface. So in this instance, if I've got an email that I need to save into SharePoint, I can simply select the email and launch the application, and then it will take me through the process of capturing that email. So in this instance, it's just an email, but it could have attachments as well. So like we can do in the thick client of Outlook, where you can capture emails and attachments, we can do the same here as well. So if we just go through that process, you'll see that I've selected the email. I'm then prompted to say, where do I want to save that particular item? So for example, here I can see, you know, the sites that I'm connected to, sites that I've pinned for easy access, my recent locations and things. So I can easily, again, navigate around through my site structure. So let's just take that example that we were just using a moment ago and say that I want to save this email to the same location. And let's go to our GDPR folder that we created earlier. And I'm just going to save that email to there. Now you'll notice it's also capturing all the metadata around that email as well. So like we had in the thick client, where we're capturing, you know, who the email was sent from, what the subject was, who it was sent to, etc. Harmony is also Harmony in a browser is also capturing that information. So even if I'm accessing my email from a browser interface, but also on a mobile device or on a Mac, for example, which doesn't support normal kind of plugins to Outlook. It does support the apps that we have here. So I've got a nice consistent way to capture content both from the thick client and the thin client. So again, if we take a look at that library from here, for example, and go to that GDPR interface or folder that we created, you'll see that I've got some emails that I've captured from the thick client, but also that email that we just captured from the web client as well. And the same information is being captured. And then I can open up those stored emails directly into Outlook, wherever they were saved from. So hopefully that answers that question.
Great. Thank you, Richard. You were showing before topics. How are those generated and mapped?
Okay, so Harmony has introduced the topics mechanism. Basically, it's our own mechanism called collage, which is a service that you can enable within Harmony, and it uses AI and learning mechanisms to actually identify keywords, proper nouns, and predefined. It can be predefined topics from the emails that you're selecting. So, as I go through, let's take a different email for here, and you'll see that it will display different topics depending on the email that I've selected. It also means that I can then use that information to, as we saw before, suggest locations or map that information to metadata in SharePoint, or even to navigate around my SharePoint and Exchange data, as well as data from other services as well. So in a nice, easy to use way, we can actually bring together information from a number of different sources, not just SharePoint. Obviously, if there's documents that have been defined in SharePoint that use those topics as metadata, then I can display that information nice and easily as well.
Great. Thank you. On that screen that you were showing before you went into your demo, there was a link to the European Union's GDPR page, but you also had something about a white paper. Where can I get that?
Yeah, absolutely. So just going back to the topics that we talked about. Right. I did just kind of give a very short introduction to it there. But if anybody is interested in knowing more about how the topics works and is interested in testing it in their environment, then please feel free to contact us to discuss your requirements in more detail and for you to get a better understanding of how the whole collage and topics engine is working and how it can support your requirements. So thanks, Susan. Let's just go back to the slide there. Yep, so there is a white paper around all of the topics and areas that we've discussed today, available on our website. The link is available here. So please feel free to go and download that and take a look at some of the content in there.
Great. Thank you. If we haven't answered your question, someone will get back to you shortly. David, Richard, thank you for that wonderful presentation and demonstration. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. You'll receive an email with a link to view this webinar, again, within a couple of days, and to download the white paper. And we look forward to meeting you again at our next webinar. Thank you.